Well, let this be a lesson to never judge a book by its cover. What is up, everybody? Welcome to my review of Hostel Part 3, the culmination of my Hostel review series and the last film to talk about before we get to 31 on 31, Pain and Suffering. And this was actually a first-time watch for me, being that the first two films, despite the things that I appreciate about them, are not necessarily movies that are my favorites or movies that I would ever really care to rewatch that much. I really had no faith going into a direct-to-video movie that has Eli Roth's involvement absolutely nowhere. So I never really gave this thing a chance. Never heard anybody in the horror community say anything praiseworthy about it that would give me any interest. I know it was directed by Scott Spiegel, who is somebody that, if you don't know, he is one of the co-writers of Evil Dead 2. He's also directed a number of horror films, I think From Dusk Till Dawn 2, which I haven't seen since it came out. Can't tell you if it's any good or not. And he also directed this movie called Intruder, which is kind of an interesting little 80s slasher that takes place in a grocery store. It's got some really good gore in it. So that gave me a little bit of intrigue, but I walked into this one expecting, no question, this is going to be a piece of shit. Well, color me shocked when I checked this thing out, and don't get me wrong, it's got its issues. It's not a great horror film by any means, but it was so much better than I thought it was going to be. Starting off with the positives, I think this movie actually does a really good job at taking what you know about the first two films and having preset expectations for how things are going to go in this third film and effectively subverting those expectations at a couple different points. There's a few different attempts at plot twists and plot reveals here to kind of change up the pace of the movie and change up how things went in the first two films to how they're going to go down in this one. And pretty much all of them caught me by surprise. I think they were really well set up. They were really well done. And I can't really say the first two films are something that I admire on a story level. So of the three, I think this one actually has the most ambition when it comes to the narrative. There's a really great scene that sets off the movie where you have this American dude walk into this hotel room and you've got these two foreigners in there that there seems to be something a little bit off about them, and they're given these vibes that they're trying to lure this guy in. They're trying to get him to drink some vodka, and then nervously he pulls out these American beers. He's like, well, let's just drink these beers instead. And then it turns out he is the one who is trying to lure them in and the one trying to drug them to eventually be murdered and tortured. And that really caught me off guard, and it set me off at a point where I'm like, shit, I'm 7 minutes in and I'm already digging this. They do some interesting things to kind of expand on what all the elite hunting group does, where the first two films is just about paying to kill people, and this one it's about paying to watch people get killed, almost like a game show, and they're taking bids and placing bets on how many arrows it takes to kill this person or what weapon the killer's actually going to use to finish the job. And it's just a really interesting spin, especially being in the Vegas setting, that brings a little different flavor to it.
Please listen. I have a wife, I have a fucking daughter, I have a son. They're 6 and 4 years old.
For family, 1 minute 58 seconds. The over-under was 2 minutes. Congratulations to players 2, 5, and 7.
And there's a reveal by the third act of somebody's villainous motivation that I even thought that was pretty well done. It's simple, it's basic, but there's a line of dialogue in here about when it comes to pussy, I don't have any friends, that we have all known somebody like that. We have all had a friend that we are no longer friends with because they are that person. And as basic as it is, it was effective. I'm like, yeah, I can buy into that very easily. I even thought bringing it over to America and setting it in Vegas, one of the busiest and loudest cities in the entire country, and very plausible to me that you could have this little area sectioned off where people are being murdered and tortured and trafficked, and nobody knows, nobody cares, nobody even has a hint of it because they're off gambling and partying and drinking and throwing up and fucking, and it worked. Acting across the board here was decent. I had lower expectations being that it was a straight-to-video movie, but for what they are required to do, they do decent enough. The lead character, he kind of gave me like CW Lifetime vibes, and then oddly enough, I look up and the only things that he has done that I recognize are CW and Lifetime shows, so I guess I have a knack for picking those people out, but nonetheless, he does okay as the lead character. He's not as endearing as the characters of the first two, but he's fine. You have Sunshine in here from Remember the Titans. Sunshine! And he's kind of the more loud of these characters, and so he fits that personality very well, and I thought that he was an entertaining enough character to kind of not know exactly how you feel about him. I was really surprised to see John Hensley in this, who famously played Matt McNamara on Nip Tuck, one of the biggest piece of shit TV characters of all time. And I think what surprised me the most is that his character is easily the most likable and the most sympathetic of this group of douchebag friends. And just simply because he has to walk around with a cane. It's like the simplest plot device to make somebody feel helpless or sympathetic in this situation, but it works because you have a guy that I only know is playing this despicable person, and here immediately I'm like, oh, don't kill him, he's nice. And overall, you know, again, this is not a movie that I would recommend to a bunch of people, just like the first two films. This is not a horror sequel classic. This is not something that I'm probably going to rewatch anytime soon if I do rewatch, but simply because of how ambitious the story was by comparison and how many genuine surprises it had in store for me, and even the fact that it felt a little less visceral in a certain way to where it was a little more easily digestible. Of the three, I would probably say this one is the most rewatchable of the three. Not the best, but the most rewatchable. Moving on to the negatives, this is a significantly lower budget production, and it shows. It just feels like a lower production. It almost has a bit of a TV quality in certain degrees. The production on the gore is significantly lower. There's not near as much gore to be shown, which that in and of itself is a negative in a franchise that is known for how over the top and visceral and disgusting the gore and the kills are. This one is very tame by comparison. You really only get one genuine kill, which is a face peeling scene that is still kind of obscured. You kind of see it from the back of the doctor's head for most of it. So if the first two films are like a 10 out of 10 as far as disgusting level of gore, this one's like a 3. But even when you look at the actors that are available and even some of the effects with explosions and things that are going on, it's a significantly lower budget film. It looks like a direct-to-video movie, which, you know, they might have done everything they could with their budget, but when you look at a film and you can tell it was a cheap production, for as much credit as I will give to the actually effective twist that they pull off, I do think that they attempt a fake out a bit too many times in this. There's at least 4 different scenes where visually they're setting up something that looks very familiar from the first two films, and then it turns out to be a bit of a gag. It turns out to be a bit of a joke on the audience. But once you're clued into the fact that the movie has done that a few times, every time that they slowly set up a visual to give you a certain expectation, now you're on the defense and you're like, okay, clearly this is going to end up being something different than what they're trying to make it look like. And it does. So it's not effective the more it goes on. I also felt the third act of the film gets way too action-y. You know, this is not a franchise that has ever really been action forward, and I don't feel like it really has a place. I think it actually kind of kills a lot of the tension and a lot of the dread of the situation that they're supposed to be kind of brewing. So once it turns into guy versus guy and we're swinging maces and there's explosions and it's too much for a movie series like this. It just doesn't fit. And finally, carrying the torch for the first two films, the writing as far as the character development in this movie is, again, very basic. It's just assembling a bunch of characters with one distinct characteristic, and that becomes their character arc. You have the cripple and sympathetic character, you have the obnoxious drunk character, you have the obnoxious rich character, and then you have the guy who is clearly going to be a little bit moral and a little bit more reserved with what he does in Vegas because he's going to get married. And there's not really much of an arc that's explored with any of them, save for a little bit with the main character and him kind of rising to the occasion by the end of it, I guess, but that's not necessarily a character arc. That's just kind of a plot arc that he goes through. I mean, you have to rise to the occasion if you're going to survive something like this. So yet again, the big Achilles heel of this franchise is the characters. They become more so just caricatures, which sometimes can be effective in horror films. Sometimes that's all you need. But when we're 3 films into a franchise and that's all we've gotten for 3 movies, it starts to get a little dry. But overall, guys, I was genuinely surprised with this one. If you watched the first 2 movies and you were shied away or you were discouraged from checking out the third one the same way that I was, please give it a shot because it's actually got some merit. It was very cheap to buy and to rent on VOD. I'm sure the DVD's even cheaper. It's got some good stuff going for it. It's got some interesting story directions to change up the pace from the first 2 films. But walk in knowing a lot of the pitfalls of a direct-to-video horror sequel are absolutely going to be at play here. Well, that's it for this one, guys. Please, if you enjoyed that, check out my 2023 new release reviews, and I'm also going to put my playlist up here of all the other Hostel reviews, which I've done all 3 of them at this point. Keep your eyes peeled for 31 on 31 Pain and Suffering coming on the 31st. Like, share, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss that 31 on 31. And as always, remember, opinions are like assholes, but that doesn't mean you have to be.